Good afternoon. Welcome to the first of many in our new series about education law and whether or not your child uh, has been provided with the free and appropriate education that was promised by federal and state law. We are going to talk about different things each day and be able to evaluate or give you a tool to evaluate if your child has been denied FAPE during the stay-at-home order, during distance learning, what will happen over the summer, and things that you really need to look out for IEPs for next year. So we're going to start with the end in mind. Obviously, the purpose of the IDEA is to level the playing field, and that whatever education is provided to the gen ed population is required to be provided to the special ed population. So in doing that, accommodations and supports need to be put in place to allow equal access to education. Now remember, this is equal access to an appropriate education, not the best education. So with that being said, let's start with the end. We want our children to be where they would have been if they were in a brick and mortar school. So the next point of inquiry has to be going back to that IEP and looking at all the goals that were in there. The problem that we have with goals in 9 out of 10 cases that I see is that goals are vague. They're not specific enough. They're not measurable enough. Kind of the adage about the adequacy or accuracy of IEPs is if a substitute teacher walked into the classroom, did not know your child, could they pick up the IEP and determine what needed to be done for that particular child on a particular day? So, for example, if you have, that, Bobby is going to improve his reading 70%, that is not a measurable goal. That we first of all, we don't know what improve means. What's the baseline? Where are we starting? Where do we want to end up? That's better written to say that it's, that he's going to go from reading, you know, 25 word books to 45 word books by the end of, the summer, or or in the next 3 months, and then there should be a provision. If that's going to be reading the same book every day, is it going to be reading different books? Is it a book that he's familiar with and has some rote memory about, or a totally new text that we're starting from scratch? Is it a book that the pictures can tell the story? Is it a book that the pictures help a little, but the words really are telling the story? Or is it a book with no pictures, or a book with no words, depending on what kind of learner we have? So part of what, when you're thinking about each one of these goals, and if you pull out your child's IEP right now, and you just do that little inquiry with each one, you're going to be astounded at how broad and general these the goals are. And that is the first problem, and that we see, well, the most common. And so then when we started with distance learning and the stay-at-home order, then a lot of the different folks that were responsible for delivering that education were no longer accessible or available. So if an IEP states that a child should have 20 hours of speech and language a month, and there was no speech pathologist or language expert available to the child during distance learning, then they have been denied FAPE. If the IEP says that they are going to learn how to use the attack board to create sentences with pictures or to understand directions like up, down, sit, go get in line, all those different things, then that those materials should have been provided to the parents to have at home. If a child is used to counting with blocks to determine how many are in a set, then those blocks should have been provided at home. So I think that kind of gets the message across. If your child is supposed to be taking tests in a quiet place, and there were tests given um, on, during the stay-at-home order, or quizzes given during the stay-at-home order, and there was no quiet place in your home, that is not a violation of FAPE. That's probably just not trying hard enough. The school is responsible for, keeping the child on task, keeping their child on the path of success. And so when we're looking at that and looking at the different grade levels, that's all determined by, every month or every quarter, there should be personal observation, or there should be some objective measuring tool, whether it's a test or it could be oral verbal testing. It doesn't matter, but it could be observation if there are behavioral issues. So those are all really important things to look at, the measurable goals, and determine if all of the services were provided and if there was progress at all on the goals, and if you can even figure out how to measure the goals. I think that a lot of times in IEP meetings, parents get very overwhelmed and they don't understand the amount of questions that they actually can ask and should ask. I am amazed every time I'm talking to parents, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, Billy hasn't been evaluated since first grade, and now Billy's in high school." And they just kept doing the same IEP over and over and over again. And the parents are saying, "But he really isn't, he hasn't improved. I mean, nothing's changed." Well, if there's no improvement and nothing's changed, then the goals aren't correct. They're not appropriate, or the supports aren't appropriate. The accommodations aren't appropriate. Um, a lot of children who have trouble focusing during classroom instruction. There's a lot of kids, there's one source of education. Those kids may need an accommodation where they receive the teacher's notes or the PowerPoint ahead of time. They may need an aide that records the lecture while they're taking notes. So if they get to a spot in their notes where they're lost and they're not sure where they left off, they can leave a blank spot on the paper, continue taking notes, and go back with this pen and put it right down on that on the paper. And the pen will go right to that segment of the recording. So the child at their own speed can then fill in the notes to have an adequate study guide or whatever it is that they were doing. It's If it's math, a lot of principles uh, are taught where you do the math problem, and while you're working through the math problem, the teacher would come over, or parapro would come over, an aide would come over and make sure that you're calculating properly. Well, obviously you can't have that happen at home. And if you're anything like me as a parent, I can't do their math once they're up in high levels of math. So they don't even divide the same way that we learned how to divide. So it's very different. So we need to make sure that the children got those supports and accommodations. There were several Michigan Department of Education memos that came out during COVID-19. Well, during the stay-at-home order, I should say, I shouldn't limit it to COVID-19, but during the stay-at-home order. And the first one came out on March 13th, 2020, and it is authored by Scott Konensnecht, I think that's how you pronounce it, who is the Deputy Superintendent of Pre-K through 20 system and student transitions. And it was this particular memo is about the compliance requirements of IDEA during a public health emergency. And it starts out by saying, after the thank you to the education community that they responded so quickly. And again, this is on March 13th. It's important that local decisions are made in accordance with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services recommendations designed to help prevent the spread of coronavirus. The state is taking proactive steps to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in Michigan. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation in reducing the coronavirus risk to Michigan residents. Okay, so we've just finished the first paragraph. We still have no mention or guidance from the Michigan Department of Education about distance learners and special ed. Then they go into that during a public health emergency, what is the potential impact if there's a closure on the IDEA compliance requirements and the delivery of early intervention services. And basically, they said that it's up to the intermediate school districts, the ISDs, and that services must be put in place. Whatever is offered to gen ed must be offered to special ed, and that the services would be determined by each person's individual education plan, their IEP. So if you listen to our last series that we just concluded, we talked about, I think it was week 2, and then sporadically after that, about how I urged everyone, go amend your IEP right now. Distance learning, how are we going to do this? What is it going to look like? Well, if you didn't do it then, you probably need to do it now, because we don't know, especially with young kids, if they're going to be in a brick and mortar school next year, come the fall. We have no idea. But think about how nearly impossible it would be to social distance kindergarteners. Probably up to second grade, it's probably a really Herculean task. And so how are they going to pull this off? So it's important to ask the questions now and make sure that your child gets everything that they need and that they are entitled to, even if it is learning from home. The other memo that came out on March 13th, again, dealt with compliance requirements of the IDEA, and except it also included the MARS rules, which are the Michigan Administrative Rules for Education, for special education. And basically, this memo gave different scenarios. If the school's closed, then it said that the local education agency, which means a school, does not provide if the local education agency does not provide services for its students, then the local education agency is not required to provide services for students with IEPs. So that's what we just talked about a minute ago. If gen ed gets it, special ed gets it. If gen ed doesn't get it, special ed doesn't get it. And it kind of goes through what happens if school is closed, but there's distance learning. And I bet that most people didn't even know that on March 13th, 2020, there are 4 paragraphs in this memo. I'm not sure if you can see it, that specifically talk about distance learning and what under the IDEA every student with an IEP is entitled to in order for there to be a free, appropriate public education, FAPE. And it doesn't really say much because no one ever contemplated that we would be in this situation. So the advisory information is for districts to consider the technology needs of each student with an IEP and try to provide access to the tools, the assistive technology, the props, the prompts, the cues, the cards, whatever it is. and they must be prepared to provide internet on a case-by-case basis, at high-speed internet, actually, if children do not have that availability in their home or even in their area where they live. Um, it also it encourages people to consider having virtual IEP meetings to make a determination on a case-by-case basis what additional things need to be in the IEP. If there was already a component of homebound services in the IEP, and the perhaps a teacher has been coming to the house once a week, or even more often than that. That's sort of the classic example. And the parent requests that the district no longer provide that service because they don't want strangers in their house. Then that would not be a denial of FAPE if it was at the parent's request, unless it can be shown that there wasn't, proper notice that it was still available. So that's another little backdoor to protecting rights. IEPs are supposed to be reviewed annually, and that should still happen. The initial evaluation timelines, where the number of days after a parent requests an evaluation or after a child is found under the child find provisions of the IDEA, then those timelines were extended if there's an agreement of the district and the parents to extend them to allow the evaluation process to continue in a safe way. You can also extend the timelines for re-evaluation, which is what happens every 3 years. And that is also something that's available during this distance learning. So that all came out on March 13th, and I know that that's a lot. Then on March 23rd, we had, again, the Individuals with Disabilities Act during K through 12 school closure due to Executive Orders 2020-11 and 2020-21, which were the stay-at-home order and the extension of the stay-at-home order. And this went into more detail about how there should be a discontinuation of early on services, but pretty much everything else should continue. And then on May 20th, we got to, I'll call it the meat of the whole thing, because this is where they talk about guidance to parents for information and resources for distance learning and during the shutdown period. And May 20th, 2020, they came out with this wonderful little book, Guidance for Compliance with IDEA and the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education during COVID-19 pandemic. See, it was originally written on April 10th and then revised on May 18th. And I hate to be the skeptic, but this was too little too late, because there was no guidelines other than schools, you need to keep doing what you're doing, and you need to do what you're doing for your gen ed, for your special ed. And so this is really kind of the golden ticket to see if your child was denied FAPE is contained in here. And so this is going to be really critical. It is 27 pages long, and you can get it on the Michigan Department of Education website. I can also post it on the Facebook page if anyone just wants to download it from there. And it really just goes into, all the things that they were obligated to do. And then some of the, there's a lot of really good definitions, a lot of behavior planning resources. And then, and it doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't really go into whether or not compensatory education is available. So compensatory education, as most of you know, is a great remedy, and it's basically, if, although it's not explicitly offered by the IDEA, a court can grant compensatory education, or you can um, request it as part of a settlement in lieu of going to court and filing a due process complaint when your child was denied FAPE. So compensatory education is, educational hours in addition to what they're regularly doing to make up the time that they missed because they were not receiving FAPE. It's really, it can be easy to fashion or difficult to fashion depending on what district you're in. But essentially, it's tools to get your child where they would have been had they been provided FAPE. So a really easy example of where compensatory education comes in often is in speech and language. And and there's a couple different ratios that are in the case law that what is appropriate for compensatory education. If it's one-on-one, 1 hour missed, 1 hour given back. Some courts have said it's 1 for every 5. Some courts have said it's 1 for every 10. So it really just depends on a case by case basis, and it depends what areas of the IEP we're compensating for, or the district is compensating for. Like I said, one that is really, we see all the time are compensatory services for speech and language, or compensatory services for occupational or physical therapy. And those are really easy to put in place. Sometimes they're even added during the school day. They can be added at night or on the weekends. It just depends on what a parent works out with the district. And the so there's I mean, and the sky's the limit as to what that looks like. They have a little bit difficulty if a child is going to age out before they have received all of their services. Students age out of of receiving compensatory education at 22. Well, we all know that some children who learn differently don't graduate from high school by the time they're 22. So there are other provisions that can kick in. There's also, if there could be a violation of the stay put order. You know that if you disagree with the placement recommendation at the IEP, then your child stays put while you litigate whether or not they've been denied FAPE or what the proper placement should be. And so those are some things to think about. And I know that was a ton of information to get us started, but I think that as the week goes on, it will all make more sense. Please, if you have any questions, send them to me either through Messenger or through or post on the page, or you can always call me or email me directly, 248-792-3060, or 248, or I'm sorry, or Lisa at kdlawgroup.com, and I'll make sure I answer your questions tomorrow, or you can just stick them in the chat right now. So with that, I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful day, and we will be back tomorrow to talk about how to determine what the questions you should be asking yourself, how to look at the goals more closely, are to determine if your child has been denied FAPE. So I hope that you have a great day. Stay safe. Can't say stay home anymore, but just stay safe. Bye.